So I hope you have downloaded the case study and had a good read of it, so that you're reasonably familiar with what's there. So let's begin by looking through the overall sort of case study. It's a very typical shape, fairly small introduction. Then there's information about 5 exhibits, which are going to provide additional important information. There is probably a reasonable correlation between the exhibits and the parts of the question, but it's not guaranteed, and it certainly shouldn't be that only exhibit 1 can be used for question 1 and so on. And then you have the requirements, and you see that all of the requirements have got something to do with professional skills here. Here it's communication skills, 2 marks. If you add up the professional skills components, you should find it comes to 20 marks. So in this question, we have this case study. We have like 5 questions. Notice it's telling you who you are in each question. To my mind, that's not going to make a huge amount of difference to your answer. What will make a difference is perhaps to whom you are writing the memorandum or briefing paper report. So presumably here we're writing to the IT director, who maybe doesn't understand very much about maybe discounted cash flows or whatever it's going to be. So here we have our 5 requirements basically. And then we get on to looking at the exhibits. First one is a letter of complaint from a group of customers. And then the second one is a business case produced internally, suggesting we should have a new computer system. Then the third one, notes of a meeting with various participants and what they've suggested going down there, and like that. And then we have a kind of mock-up of a newspaper article. And then finally we have an email that's come from a very discontented to a rep, really telling us that he thinks there's fraud and bribery and so on going on in a particular location. And what you should be doing as you go through these is to be trying to maybe underline or to look at information which is potentially going to be of relevance to us. And you should always be thinking, why has the examiner bothered telling me this? So here we have, we're told it's a privately owned company. Now, why would they tell you it's a privately owned company and not a listed company? Well, maybe there's something to do here with corporate governance. Maybe the corporate governance isn't so good because maybe it doesn't have to be so good. Or maybe it should be so good, but there's no way of enforcing it to be so good as with a listed company. As it happens, it's nothing in this question, this case study, isn't really at all about governance. Privately owned means that maybe the handling of the stakeholders is a little bit easier. If it's privately owned, you have a very limited number of shareholders, and that's maybe easier to deal with than maybe hundreds of different shareholders who can't agree on maybe a particular course of action. But anyway, the examiner has seen fit to give us that information. It's been formed quite a while ago, so it's not an upstart. It's had a reasonable life. It's fairly stable, successful, presumably. And we still have Jan Martin in here, presumably the founder, the original shareholder who's still there. That might be good. It might, however, mean that this person started us off 20 years ago. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe they want to get out. Maybe they're out of date. Maybe they're perfectly good. But it's maybe worth bearing in mind that we have a person here who in a way could either be a strength or a weakness to the organization. We're told it's upmarket. So this is not the kind of cheap and cheerful 2 weeks lying on the beach sort of holiday. It's fairly upmarket. It's in terms of strategy. It's maybe something to do with differentiation and maybe focus, because this is trekking and cycling, which is a relatively focused small part of the overall holiday market and so on, and sold to fairly demanding clients. So again, we need to be careful maybe in terms of quality. That the quality has to be kept fairly high if we're going to be keeping these clients coming back to us, presumably paying a reasonably high price. They're supposed to be for groups of people 10 to 16. We can do a bit of tailoring there if we need to. Head office is supposed to be dealing with all the travel arrangements and so on there. However, maybe a slightly aged IT system. This may become an issue. It depends really what we're trying to get the IT system to do, whether 6 years of age is going to be a problem or not. Most of the guides have worked for us for many years, and they've got great local knowledge. So there's really a considerable resource which is in here. And we need to be thinking of, hanging on to that resource, making good use of that resource, and so on. We sometimes have full-time representatives employed in the foreign countries if it's big enough the market's big enough to warrant that. Profits have stagnated, and we want to stop a decline in profits and look for expansion opportunities. So maybe there's a little bit of almost forewarning there of maybe what one of the questions is going to be dealing with. And then we have operational problems, and almost certainly this is going to come up later when we're asked to solve part of the case study. Let's look at the exhibits, not to go through them in detail, but just to think what we've got in here is a letter of complaint. We'll go over the requirements, get on to the exhibits. There's first of all a letter of complaint in here, where we've had 24 customers from a recent tour who've got this long list of complaints there that we weren't allowed to visit where, the brochure said we're going to be visiting here. That there were too many people, 24 people as opposed to a maximum of 16. So in a way it was more crowded, there was maybe less time, less access to the guide and so on, more queuing up and so on there. Accommodation was difficult, first of all because of the large number of people trying to get them into one hotel, and also because the hotel bookings seemed to have gone astray in some way, and we ended up really all over the town. Our guide, Chaz Tears, seemed to be really hacked off about something very unsatisfactory, very demotivated. Initially it might have been thought that he was just a bad guide or in a bad mood, but then later on we see that there's some difficulties here with the local rep, and also the guide was finding it quite difficult with very large tour groups and so on here. Then we have this meal allowance stopped, and these people are probably not paid a huge amount, and to expect them then to go out socializing with clients and customers, paying out of their own pocket in tourist type restaurants, is probably unrealistic. Two members of the group had wanted to go on somewhere else, and their bookings were completely missed off. This was a head office problem. Second exhibit is a so-called business case for a new computer system there. The new computer system, the writer of this says, it has been produced because the existing booking system is adequate. Just let's think who actually wrote this here. So we look to our list of exhibits up here. Just see who's actually written this here. Written by a new IT recruit. So we've got a new IT recruit coming in, maybe only a month or so in the company, and suddenly has come to the conclusion that the company booking system is inadequate. Can we trust that judgment? And this person asserts that the reason for mess-ups in bookings and inefficiencies and so on is down to the old computer system, you always expect IT people to say that. IT people believe that everything can be cured by having a nice new shiny computer which works more quickly. And of course that's far from the case. It could be that the problem is with people. I think if we remember back to the introduction, it said there had been quite a high turnover of people recently, and it could be that they're simply missing skills at head office rather than the IT system being inadequate. At least this person has put on deliverables, what the scope really of the project should be, what we expect to be getting out of this here. And then has done some sort of cost-benefit analysis. At least has had the idea maybe of doing it using discounted cash flow and so on. Whether an IT person has got the skills to do a net present value analysis is something we maybe need to be looking at. And one thing you should always do if you're given any sort of budget, any sort of cost-benefit analysis, is you can say nearly everything on this analysis is at best an estimate, at worst a blind guess. And if ever you're asked to evaluate something on a budget or a cost-benefit analysis, every single figure can be questioned. Where did that come from? How reliable is it? How sensitive, perhaps, is the answer to having that figure correct? If you don't question it, I think part of the question, the professional skills will say, we're looking for professional skepticism. And professional skepticism would be picking away at these figures, saying, well, do I believe that? What's the evidence for that? It's almost doing an audit on these figures. Next, there is this staff meeting. Everyone's putting in their idea. I think if you go through this, you'll find there's kind of 4 ideas. One is to go away from just the younger people to become attractive maybe to the older market as well. One is to expand the type of adventure or tours we do, maybe bring in skiing and scuba diving and so on, which maybe not covered by our existing menu, which is going to be there. Even bringing in beach holidays. And then we have an idea of really diversifying, going into fitness, and we also have the suggestion of cost saving. Now, those 4 ideas, just without telling the answer, they may spark off a particular model, where really we're looking at, could we go into a different market, the older holiday makers market? Could we produce different products, in other words, different sort of products? Could we get efficiency gains through cost saving? Could we go into diversification where both the market and the product both change together? I won't give you any more hints about maybe what might be helpful in that. Then we have the newspaper article written, I think, by quite almost a prejudiced journalist here. This person can see no good in maybe the holiday market as such, and with us in particular, seem to have a bit of a chip on his or her shoulder here about rich kids going to relatively poor countries and kind of observing the poverty almost. Whether that's a fair or ethical point or accusation to be making against us is something we maybe need to consider. And finally, we have an email from the representative, from the tour guide. Remember, this one was the one who was quoted or in the letter of complaint from the holidaymakers. This was their representative. Okay, so we may learn a little bit more from this email about why this representative is particularly demotivated, seems to be not performing well, whereas presumably had been performing well up to now, otherwise we wouldn't have kept this representative on, this tour guide on. And this person seemed to have really declined in motivation and performance for some reason. I think when you read through this, you will see that there's some quite outrageous bribery being alleged, and similarly some fraud going on, and we will have to see what should be done about that. Now, what we should then do is, having you've got fairly familiar with this, and you go back between the exhibits and the requirements and so on. If we go up to these requirements, see what they are. And the requirement number 1 here is a briefing paper, about 2 presentation slides with accompanying notes, explaining a specific model. You either know this or you don't. This paper really is a mixture between knowing some models, frameworks, facts, if you like, and applying those models, frameworks, facts. And here we're asked to explain the model and how it could be applied to what, a very classic sort of thing to be doing. If you're not asked to explain something, I wouldn't bother explaining it too much. Depending who you're writing to, of course, most of the skills, most of the marks will tend to be for applying models. But here we're asked to do both. Remember, if you're doing presentation slides, not to make them too cluttered. There are sort of rule of thumb suggestions, no more than 7 lines per slide, no more than 7 words per line. I mean, those are obviously a little bit flexible, but what you don't want to do is kind of write out an essay on a PowerPoint slide. Then we have a briefing paper. It talks about the contextual features of change. And if you're talking about contextual features of change, the only place that the word contextual comes up is Balogun and Hope Haley. They had a model for change which looked at basically variables, which are what the contextual features are, and this is a hint that you probably get on quite well if you were to use that. And then it asks for another specific model, and again, if you don't know the model, you're going to be defeated really in this. This is not really asking you to explain the model, it's explaining how it could be used, how it could be relevant to what. So don't spend ages explaining it. Next one, we now are a manager in the accounts department. We don't understand the approaches and assumptions used in the proposal, and we have to write a memorandum which critically reviews and evaluates the business case. So you expect to find holes in it. You expect to raise objections to it. You expect it often to be wrong. And you have to explain maybe why it's wrong, what other information you need, where we need to have great care, and so on. And of course, we have got in here professional skepticism skills and analysis skills. Analysis skills, for example, what other sort of information would we need? Maybe how else could we go about maybe producing a decent business case? Third one, we have to go through the suggestions as to how the business could expand. And also here, it recommends what the business should do. So we've got, I think, 4 suggestions. And what we have to do is come down on one of them. To some extent, it will often not matter which of the recommendations you go for. It's really how you argue the point. Because no little case study can be full enough to give you all information you might require. By all means, maybe suggest other information that you might like before you can make up your mind up more definitively. And also, it's not saying here, it doesn't say recommend which of the options the business should follow. It's not suggesting that any of these options are mutually exclusive. There's no reason why you couldn't cost cut and do one of the other options here. Very often people, when they want to increase profits, might try a number of different methods at the same time. Then we have this rather aggressive article that was written about us here. Here, a briefing paper for discussion at the next board meeting describes the importance of ethics in the current business environment. That, if you like, is part one of the question. And also what we need to do is to provide a framework which will allow us to move forward and to deal with ethical issues. And you may remember that there's an approach which is available in dealing with ethical questions, which deals with 5 questions, really. So the framework which we might, or you might possibly remember, is one which is called Tucker. It's always better if you can use a recognized model or framework to answer a question. This is not an exam called Common Sense. This is an exam with a recognized syllabus, with recognized models. And the idea of a model is that if you use one, you give a more respectable, more believable, more professional answer than you would do just kind of making it up on the day. Obviously, if you can't think of a particular model, make it up on the day, but it's not going to be as good an answer. Commercial acumen here is kind of looking maybe at realistic areas. This journalist has piled abuse on us here. Maybe we have to think, how could we diffuse? What sort of measures could we maybe use to deflect these sort of articles in the future? And that is an example of professional acumen, insight. And finally, we are the assistant to the CEO. We have this email from Mr. Tiaz here. And this is fairly factual, some of it. There is a legal status of the whistleblower, and we should, I think, even though it doesn't specifically say here, talk about the legal position of our particular whistleblower here. Whether the local agent or representative has been guilty of the offence of bribery, some judgment required in there. Whether the fraud appears committed, and the next steps that should be taken. So, what I suggest you do now is you at least write notes for each of the parts of the case study, at least noting down the sort of points you would make. If you don't do that and you simply go to the answer, you're sitting there thinking, well, I could have said that, I could have said that. It's only when you compare your notes with what's in the model answer that you notice basically what's the variances. It could be a favourable variance where you have noticed something and made a point that is not in the model answer, because the model answers will not be comprehensive, they never will be. Or it could be what I would call an adverse variance, particularly where there's something glaringly important that's been brought out in the model answer, but which you have forgotten or omitted to put in your model answer. But this is a valuable resource, so don't waste it. And I hope you find it interesting. After you've done that, then you can download the model answers.